I'm a professor at the University of Tasmania, and actually this is where the Blue Economy CRC actually originated from. And it really was a little bit of a pathway, a journey really, in talking to several different departments across the university around what they're doing around the marine and Antarctic sectors, and also what we're doing around engineering and renewable energy. And it's built on a lot of partnerships that we've got both domestically and internationally with industry and government, and of course with research organisations like UWA. So everyone plays a really central role in helping this actually happen. We're delivering innovation in sustainable seafood, I like to say aquaculture, and renewable energy production for a marine nation, and that's really our primary goal. So a lot of people like to think a little bit about what the blue economy actually is, and it's very similar to the agricultural sector in terms of the green economy, but we're focused on our oceans. And a lot of international organisations, including the UN, have been focusing on what a sustainable blue economy looks like. And you can see that right at the top it talks about a sustainable use of our ocean resources to support economic growth and increase livelihoods and jobs, and a sustainable ocean economy. And so we think about some of the traditional sectors that we know operate in the blue economy being oil and gas, mining, resources, for example, even tourism, and maritime transport in terms of ships and ports and infrastructure. But we're actually looking at even other industries such as our traditional fishery sectors and thinking more towards sustainable offshore aquaculture production in Commonwealth waters, and also the effect on climate change and of course the circular economy in terms of the infrastructure that we put out there and the carbon footprint that that infrastructure actually has on the environment as well. So I think that probably to start from the beginning, Sea Country is central to the Blue Economy CRC, and it's central to the Blue Economy. There are long connections to our coasts and our oceans for our Indigenous people, and Sea Country is actually considered as one integrated system. That's the land and the sea together. And so this slide is courtesy of a scientist at CSIRO that talks about basically the connections that Indigenous people have both to the land and the sea. There was a high-level panel under our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, that was all around a sustainable ocean economy, and 14 countries participated in this ocean action towards sustainability, and some of the key drivers that they're looking at in terms of production and the economy is around having 6 more times sustainable food production by 2050. We can see 40 times more renewable energy by 2050, 12 more million jobs, 15 trillion benefits in sustainable ocean investments, and then also seeing a huge reduction in our GHG and carbon emissions. And so really when we look at this, we think about the role that offshore renewable energy has to play, of course, in helping us achieve this. And this is something that's quite new, I think, in Australia, to be considering the role that offshore wind, wave, tidal, floating solar, all those other resources that we have in the oceans can play a role in this. I probably will provide a little bit of context around what these statistics look like, and there are many people in the room that understand these very well, but the Australian Fisheries and Aquaculture Statistics report that was published earlier this year talks about what this looks like in terms of an industry in Australia, and you can see that it's worth $3.15 billion, and we've seen a little bit of a drop in that since last year. But what we also see is what Western Australia's portion of that is, and that's $473 million. And most of it is wild catch fisheries in terms of rock lobsters and prawns, but actually in terms of an aquaculture sector, we can see the pearl oyster industry is very significant here in Albany and across the southern margins of Western Australia. And that's the area actually that Blue Economy CRC is heavily focused on in terms of thinking about how we can increase our seafood production in Commonwealth waters. We talk about the opportunity for renewables, and we're in one of the best places in the world for wave energy. In fact, actually, Australia has the best wave resource of any country in the world, and Albany has the best wave resource of anywhere in Australia. And so it's the perfect place to be having a marine renewable energy research centre. So congratulations, Christoph, in terms of your new name. But what we do also have is an exceptional offshore wind resource, and you probably know this from the wind farms that you have here already. But that wind resource that we have in Australia is better or equivalent to that of Europe, the US, Japan and the UK combined. But as a country, we're really not exploiting these resources very well. And so that's part of what the Blue Economy CRC hopes to achieve. And of course, we also have significant other resources when it comes to tidal energy. And if we look at this, this is a map of the tidal energy in Australia, and Western Australia has some significant tidal resource around the Kimberley region. You've got significant tidal ranges, but you also have significant ocean tidal currents. And those are really significant in this area and can support local energy production for a remote power system. And then I think the other thing is that, as Michelle has kindly mentioned already, most of our population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. And so when we think about some of the advantages that we have with offshore renewables, they're very close to networks and on-land renewable energy farms. So there's no reason why we couldn't integrate offshore renewable energy with other renewable energy that we have in Australia, increasing that mix. We talk about offshore energy and some of the applications that it has, and I'm quite fortunate to come from a place like Tasmania, because King Island and Flinders Island are 100% renewable energy, and so is all of Tasmania, and it's actually nice to be part of that type of brand. And in particular, they're looking at doubling their production to 200% by 2040. And really the only way they're going to achieve that is through offshore renewables and hydrogen production. And so that's some of the areas that we're going to in the future. But we also start to look at some of the remote island communities that we have in Australia and see opportunities to help them decarbonise their energy supply as well. And then we think further down the track to the offshore industry, and we think about offshore platforms, pipelines and compression systems, and the role that we have in helping actually transition those, or not only decommission them, but actually repurpose them for other applications, such as aquaculture production, for example, in these very exposed environments. So they've been designing this infrastructure for a very long time to be able to withstand very challenging environments, so we should be using that knowledge in Australia to support other sectors to grow as well. And then a few other areas that we've already spoken about is aquaculture, of course, and that's an example of something that I'll show you in a minute. What are some of the other opportunities? A lot of people are talking about exporting energy, and this is one of the areas that I know is being discussed here in Western Australia, and this is now being considered as one of the largest onshore solar farms that's going to be generated with pumped hydro, with pumped storage for energy export to Asia. And so this is an opportunity for Australia to actually exploit its proximity to other future energy export markets. The way in which Australia is considering that is actually through the opportunities with hydrogen, and that's something that I'll talk to you about in terms of the role that we're playing there. And so here in Western Australia, it'd be great if we could see that onshore energy also include offshore renewables, such as tidal, which is right adjacent to this area here. We've got the best tidal resource in Western Australia, in all of Australia. And so that's one of the areas that we're working in as well. Who are our partners? Our partners are 40 organisations that you see on the screen, and those partners are universities in Australia and overseas. We also have a lot of industry partners that represent 3 major sectors, and that's aquaculture, offshore renewable energy, and of course the engineering industry, and that's the offshore engineering industry. And we also have developers of offshore technologies that will help us with remote sensing in our oceans and providing us information at real time to be able to make decisions offshore. And there's a number of those organisations as well. Alex Ogg is in the room. I think Christoph already acknowledged the Australian Ocean Energy Group and the role that they're playing, of course, in renewable energy in Australia in supporting industry and looking for markets for offshore renewables. So this is what our research plan looks like. It's a very complicated slide, and I'm more than happy to provide this to people, and it's on our website. But it talks about what we're trying to deliver to the blue economy through 5 research programs that you see down the left. And one of the key enablers that we see in helping support sustainable offshore aquaculture and energy production will be the development and the design and improvements to offshore infrastructure that industry can actually use to actually produce more aquaculture or energy. And that means changing the way in which that infrastructure is designed to be able to withstand more exposed environments. We also talk about autonomous systems and the role that they play in monitoring offshore, also operations in offshore environments as well to remove people out of harm's way. We talk about the need to look at delivering seafood and marine products. We've spoken a lot about, at the moment, in WA oysters, but there's interest in offshore kingfish production, as Christoph said, in Geraldton, by a company called Huon Aquaculture. And of course, Harvest Road has big interests, of course, in expanding aquaculture production both coastally and offshore. And so we have actually an opportunity here to look at both seaweeds, other fin fish, oysters and other byproducts as well as part of that seafood production supply chain in Australia. And that's some of the work that the Blue Economy CRC is involved in terms of trying to identify what those species are and use tools to identify the best locations to grow them in as well. In terms of a sustainable ecosystem, one of the roles that the CRC has been looking at in expanding into Commonwealth waters is looking at the policy and regulation that actually supports a sustainable growth of the blue economy. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but it also involves understanding and undertaking really detailed multi-sector marine spatial planning to understand the benefits to expanding offshore and also what the risks and opportunities are. There's probably a couple of advances that we've made that I want to share, and I think these are pretty significant. So far in Australia, we don't have any Commonwealth regulation that supports any expansion into Commonwealth waters. So for those who don't know what Commonwealth waters are, the coastal region is up to 3 nautical miles, which is about 5.5 kilometres. And then from 5.5 kilometres out to our exclusive economic zone, we have no regulation to support industries to expand offshore. And so the only way that Australia is going to be able to achieve this is to introduce new policy and regulation that supports this both at a Commonwealth level and also at a state level as well. And that's something that the CRC has been very heavily involved in. So what you can see on the left is a bill that was recently seen by Parliament, which is the new Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Levies Bill. And this is an opportunity to help support the commissioning of major projects in Australia to do with offshore renewables. So that's a great outcome for us. And in particular also on the right-hand side, you can actually see that there's been an amendment that's been put forward to Parliament to support offshore aquaculture as well. And that's pretty significant as well in terms of changing the offshore constitutional settlement to allow for offshore aquaculture, in particular to start with in Tasmania, but it will be relevant to every other state in Australia as well. Why are we looking at the aquaculture industry? I think this probably slide is very telling. And this is one of the markets that we think we can help support through offshore renewables. The further the salmon industry goes offshore, the more reliant they're going to be on local energy generation. And currently, most of the systems that they use offshore use diesel. And diesel is not only expensive, but it's bad for the environment. And we want to help support them to decarbonise as an industry. So at the moment, Tasmania's annual salmon production is around 63,000 head of gutted fish, of tonne of fish, and this industry is set to double by 2030. And the only way that the government will allow them to double is if they move out of the coastal zone into more exposed offshore environments in Commonwealth waters. So we're helping think about the way in which we can help support them to do that in terms of new infrastructure, remote sensing, new production systems. But another way that we want to do that is to help them decarbonise and reduce their reliance on diesel fuel. This industry would be set to use about $46 million worth of diesel alone for one company in 2030 if they were to double their production. And so there's an opportunity to reduce our emissions and diesel use. So some of the ways in which we're doing that is that we've been developing systems. And so this is a feed barge. This barge sits out in the ocean and feeds the fish at all different times of the day, 365 days a year. And so these feed barges rely on diesel fuel, and they go out on boats and refuel these every single time diesel gets low. It's very expensive, and it's not environmentally friendly, and it's not safe either. And so the way in which we want to improve it is we want to transition these away from basically diesel to wave and to hydrogen. A lot of the locations in which they farm salmon right now are very exposed to wave energy, and we see an opportunity to help use wave energy and hydrogen production to help transition them away, and this is being supported by a number of the organisations in the Blue Economy CRC. The CRC has invested a lot of money in hydrogen infrastructure as part of a demonstration project. If we want to produce hydrogen, in particular if we want to produce hydrogen offshore and help transition our oil and gas platforms to producing hydrogen, it's going to actually rely a lot on offshore renewable energy. And so we've actually been looking at a demonstration project that actually is to build a hydrogen microgrid and actually be able to take that offshore and produce through offshore renewable energy hydrogen offshore and then use it offshore for different applications. The applications that we've been looking at in the CRC have been for aquaculture, they've been for onshore electricity generation, for hydrogen export in terms of a market, but also for decarbonising our transport sector. And so we want to move away from using diesel fuel and move away to a transport sector such as the vessel that you see there, which is a WA-based company called GEV, who are looking at building a hydrogen vessel. So this would actually be able to hold enough hydrogen for them to export overseas, but also we could use that and transition away from diesel generators in vessels to actually using hydrogen fuel cells and other systems to actually run our vessels on hydrogen. And so at the moment we've built this hydrogen microgrid, and next year around August 2022 we will be supporting the first bus trial in Australia utilising hydrogen. So the Blue Economy CRC is not about buses, I know, but it's a transition towards actually working towards aquaculture sectors and also supporting actually hydrogen vessels. And so that's a big area of work that we're actually going to get into, and it supports the Tasmanian Government's Hydrogen Action Plan. So for those who don't know a lot about hydrogen, you can see there's an image on the left-hand side. So you have your renewable energy production, and then through electrolysis we split the hydrogen and the oxygen, both which have potential users in industry, and we can either store that in a fuel cell or we can convert that back to use in terms of our grid, in terms of electricity. We see lots of markets for this potential, either using it in terms of desalination. We talked about island nations, we've talked about aquaculture, we've talked about helping decarbonise oil and gas, but we also see it as other opportunities in terms of hydrogen as well. We recently completed a study to do with offshore wind in Australia. We published this report only in July this year, and this report really supported that clean energy electricity bill that was introduced to Parliament. And what we did is we undertook a very high-level mapping of where all Australia's wind resources are, and we thought about where the opportunities are to integrate offshore wind into our current renewable energy mix. And we also thought very carefully about how we could actually help support a supply chain and a workforce to be developed in Australia through the building of this industry. And I think that's really important. So many people may or may not know, and Christoph mentioned the Star of the South, which is a 2 gigawatt offshore wind farm in Victoria, but there are 12 or 13 projects like this that are being considered around Australia, and you can see many of them are actually in Western Australia. And so there are opportunities in Geraldton, in Bunbury and here in Albany to support offshore wind. The other important part is, of course, is the accessibility of this resource. A lot of the technology that's used for offshore wind, in particular those that are fixed bottom mounted turbines, that technology would come from overseas. But one of the big opportunities we have in Australia to support a new supply chain is to look at floating offshore wind. And in Australia, that will be quite necessary in terms of many of the locations having water depths greater than 60 metres, where that technology can't be fixed to the seabed. And so it also has an opportunity for us to grow that sector in Australia. And I think, lastly, it has an opportunity to grow our workforce. So this is some data that was produced by the International Renewable Energy Agency and also the OECD that looks at what the annual workforce might look like with the introduction of a new industry such as the offshore wind industry in Australia. And one of the things that I know is that Western Australia has the best oil and gas and offshore engineering expertise of anywhere in Australia, and we should be utilising that to help support this industry. So helping transition that type of sector to renewables is actually one of the ways that I think we should be going in the future. CRCs are a lot about innovation. They are about supporting industry and helping do world-class research for industry. But also we're there about supporting education and training. So one of the things that cooperative research centres do is they fund a number of PhD placements and postdoctoral research fellow placements. They place those students with industry for periods of time to get experience. They can be based with industry full-time. They work very closely and liaise with government, both state government, councils and the general community. And we've actually been running a very successful webinar series in the Blue Economy CRC that's attracting a lot of attention online. So if you're very interested, I would go to the Blue Economy CRC's website and actually join some of the webinars. We're having one next Friday specifically around wave energy. Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thanks.